Tonight on Nova, the race to build an atomic bomb didn't end with Hiroshima. In a desperate effort to catch up with the United States, Russia kidnapped German scientists, ordering them to help build a Soviet bomb.
We felt that the American process, of course, was much better than our process.
These scientists helped move the Soviet Union into the nuclear age. Nazis and the Russian bomb.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. And Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
When October came, my sister came to visit me, and it was that very day that the Russians came and picked me up. It was early, around 5 a.m. I can remember the time exactly. There were cars driving through the streets near us. We were a little out of the way.
Ja, als die Russen kamen, ja, mit Gewehrkolben an die Tür.
Yes, when the Russians came, rifle butts against the door, my brother opened up. They had an interpreter, and she said, "Everybody to Russia." And then my brother said, "But not my mother and sister, they're just visiting here." And then the interpreter said, "Everybody." And within 2 hours, we were all packed up for Russia.
Nach Russland.
Not long after the close of World War II, the Soviet Union rounded up an elite corps of German scientists whose orders were to bring Russia into the atomic age. Many of these scientists' careers had already been shaped by the rise of Adolf Hitler. Germany, 1933. Under Hitler, the country was becoming the dominant power in Central Europe. The Nazi rearmament brought industrial growth and an emphasis on engineering skills. Many Germans hoped for an end to unemployment and a future to look forward to. Germany was also a center of research into the new science of atomic physics. Professor Nikolaus Riehl was a student at the time.
Dann besuchte ich die Universität in Berlin.
Then I went to the university in Berlin. I took my doctorate with Lisa Meitner and Otto Hahn. That was how I became involved in radioactivity.
Professor Manfred von Ardenne also carried out his research into electromagnetic radiation in Berlin.
Before the Second World War, I had my institute in Lichterfelde in Berlin, now West Berlin. And very near was Dahlem, the institute of Otto Hahn.
Otto Hahn was a Nobel Prize winner who, with Lisa Meitner, studied the behavior of radioactive elements. In 1938, Meitner had to flee Germany as Hitler occupied Austria and on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, declared all-out war on the Jews.
I remember the famous Kristallnacht. A first-floor window fell right in front of me on my way to school. So I turned to these people and said to the brown shirts who were standing there, "You can't do this." A civilian grabbed me and said, "Keep your mouth shut, shrimp." I got to school and half the class was missing. I can't claim today that I saw nothing and knew nothing. The Kristallnacht took place all over Germany. You must admit it now.
As war in Europe became almost certain, so too did the results of Hahn's work on the atom. In the last months of 1938 in Berlin, he announced the discovery of the splitting of the uranium atom. Few at the time understood how much the world would be changed by these events.
Und nun, nach der Entdeckung von Hahn über die Spaltung von Uran,
after Hahn's discovery of the splitting of uranium, it was natural for me to enter this field. One's thoughts were about the so-called uranium machine, which would create a huge amount of energy and so on. That fascinated me.
Das faszinierte mich.
Not long after Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the German War Office set up a nuclear physics research center in Berlin with Professor Werner Heisenberg and Otto Hahn leading it. Dr. Riehl and Dr. Gunther Wirtz were given a government contract to produce uranium.
You know that just before the war, everybody realized in the scientific world that an atomic bomb should be possible, theoretically. And there was some estimate in Germany from the side of German scientists, us from the government, that they believed that it could take a time of 20 years to achieve this, that one has to develop a brand new technology which was not available at that time.
The future development of the German atomic bomb was decided in the Harnack House in 1942. At a secret meeting held between Hahn and Heisenberg, Field Marshal Erhard Milch, and Armaments Minister Albert Speer, Heisenberg raised the possibility of a nuclear bomb. How big would such a bomb be, asked the Field Marshal. About the size of a pineapple, said Heisenberg. But he quickly added that it would take several years to develop such a weapon. Marshal Milch left the meeting very unimpressed, and shortly afterwards authorized production of the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Speer, however, did decide to spend some money on building a nuclear reactor.
Well, but to start to do something on the second order, which was not a priority, of course, was to make a pure uranium metal for so-called critical assembly.
In the buildings of the Max Planck Institute, the German scientists proceeded with their work. In a custom-built cellar protected by walls 10 feet thick, they attempted to assemble a nuclear reactor using uranium blocks produced by Professor Riehl.
We have known that there should be this critical assembly, and that was the uranium as a metal, and then you need a moderator, and the Germans had failed to find out that pure graphite is a useful moderator, and so they had to use heavy water. So the first critical assembly was on the base of heavy water and this metal. And the results were, as far as I know, were not very interesting. It was all went with low priority.
Last not least, das Interesse von Hitler und seinen Beratern für die
Hitler and his advisors' interest in the whole of nuclear technology and uranium reactors, and also in the uranium bomb, wasn't especially great. That was too abstract. For them, it was Jewish physics.
The low priority, you see, one has to concentrate in wartime, has to concentrate on things which you can use very soon. So the V1, the V2, they were the German concept. Then we had developed, as you know, the jet-driven planes. So that were the centers of German efforts during the war. But not this year. At second priority, it was just enough to protect us from serving in the army.
As Berlin was hit by more and more air raids, the German atomic research program became non-existent. Professor Riehl and Dr. Wirtz abandoned their work and fled to the outskirts of the city. In May 1945, the Soviet army launched its final attack on Berlin. German fortunes had been totally reversed, and the capital of Hitler's Third Reich became a slaughterhouse.
Letzten Tage des Krieges, der ganze Krieg war schrecklich, und die letzten Tage des Krieges.
During the last days of the war, the whole war was terrible. The last days were even more so. We all felt in a kind of end-of-the-world mood. I lost the continuity of my scientific work, and I lost my flat. In fact, I'd lost my home, Berlin. It had been a fascinating city once. But under Hitler, it got worse and worse. It used to be a center of science and technology and of culture, a highly interesting city. But all this was lost.
Alles das, was verloren war, war verloren.
The armies of the Soviet Union invaded all of Berlin and the surrounding countryside. The Soviet Union dominated Central Europe, and Germany as a state had almost ceased to exist. By May 9th, Germany surrendered, and within days, a team of Soviet scientists were sent to locate the whereabouts of the German atomic experts. They found Professor von Ardenne and his undamaged institute.
When the Soviet scientists in May 1945 saw these working equipment, they saw that were elements also for the resolution of important nuclear problems.
Professor Riehl and Dr. Wirtz were in a village outside Berlin, but the Soviets found them too.
Und dann kamen die Russen. Und die fanden mich sofort. Es war für die gar kein Problem, mich zu finden.
Then the Russians came. They found me right away. It wasn't difficult for them to find me. 2 colonels of the NKVD, the secret police, came round and picked me up. It wasn't an arrest. It was called detaining someone for questioning. From that moment on, I was never again without a guard. I was never independent again. I was separated from my family.
Und schon am 9. Juni.
And then on June 9th, we were taken to the Soviet Union by plane. We were driven to NKVD headquarters and requested to go and see Beria, the head of the secret police, in his office. That's when I met Hertz again, and von Ardenne.
I met Beria and the big table, and before me was Zimovich and Kurchatov and the other leading nuclear scientists of the Soviet Union.
Soviet circles were primarily interested in the atom bomb, or atomic energy. And they apparently already knew more in this field than we knew in Germany.
Professor Riel's impressions were correct. The Soviet scientists that he met with Lavrenti Beria in Moscow had already started a bomb project. The Soviet Union had an active atomic research community in the 1930s based in Leningrad. Headed by Abram Yaffe, a highly regarded physicist, the institute had built a cyclotron for the study of atomic particles in 1937. Leningrad attracted many young scientists, of whom Igor Kurchatov was the most outstanding. By 1940, Kurchatov and his associates were already investigating the implications of Otto Hahn's discovery in Germany. And at a seminar that year, physicist Georgy Fyorov presented a paper on the possibility of achieving a nuclear explosion from uranium fission.
At the time, before the war, we were basically thinking of nuclear power stations, but we nevertheless felt that beside providing electric power, this phenomenon could at some time provide unique explosive force.
Гражданки Советского Союза, товарищ Сталин поручили мне сделать следующее заявление. Сегодня в 4 часа утра, без объявления войны, германские войска напали на нашу страну, атаковали наши границы во многих местах.
The German invasion in 1941 brought an end to any atomic research. The announcement of war by Molotov signaled the start of the mass evacuation of Leningrad and Moscow. Scientists were drafted to work on rebuilding the Soviet forces, and Kurchatov began work on tank armor. Yet Fyorov continued to lobby Stalin.
About this time, we captured a German pilot, a fascist flyer, who said, "So what? You shot me down. But you'll die just the same. We'll destroy you. We hold something in reserve, something horrible, which you know nothing about." I realized that if they had really succeeded in making a bomb, they would not hesitate a moment before using it. So I wrote to Stalin about it. I wrote a letter explaining what needed to be done, outlining, as if in a fantasy, the design of a possible atomic bomb.
Soviet spies in Germany and Britain confirmed Fyorov's fears, and in 1942, the State Defense Committee, headed by Stalin, set up a team to investigate building an atomic bomb. Kurchatov was appointed as its head.
Kurchatov was a very present man. I think he was the leading nuclear scientist in the Soviet Union in that time. And he was the first man also in the technical Soviets who organized the development of the atomic bomb.
The Russian physicists are, of course, first class. No question about that. All the things they knew. But Kurchatov also was one with a very, very good impression. He was really a great man. Important man.
By the time Stalin met Truman and Churchill at Potsdam in July 1945, Kurchatov's team had been working on a bomb project for over 2 years. Stalin knew from his spies that his allies, the US and Britain, had been secretly developing an atomic bomb since 1940. But it wasn't until Potsdam that Truman hinted to Stalin that the United States now had a bomb, calling it a new weapon of unusual destructive force. After the United States dropped the atomic bomb, Wirtz was summoned to Moscow from Siberia, where he had been scouting a site for a uranium plant.
The dropping of the bomb had changed the situation, of course, basically. So we came back, and at that time they had already decided to reinstall the small plant nearer to Moscow in a small town called Elektrostal. This was really a shock for all the Germans, because we felt that now that was not a thing just to begin with, because it was clear that at that time for everybody was clear that already the superpowers were more or less in competition, and that the Americans with the bomb had, of course, very strong weapon in their hands, and that the Russians that was priority number one for the Russians now to have the bomb.
The decision to pursue the bomb was made at great cost to the Soviet people. The German invasion and the subsequent defeat of Nazi Germany left the Soviet Union with millions of dead and massive destruction of their factories and farms. The United States' effort to build the bomb had involved $2 billion in 1945 and the resources of over 100,000 people. To the smashed economy of the Soviet Union, the race to catch up represented an almost inhuman struggle. But in the minds of the Soviet rulers, there was no question but to proceed with the development of the bomb.
To begin with, there was absolutely unavoidable to have this uranium metal. That was the number one on the route to plutonium.
Die Hauptaufgabe war die Herstellung des Urans.
The main task in hand was the production of uranium in a form that would be suitable for use in an atomic reactor. This was one problem that we had already almost solved in Germany.
Das Problem hatten wir in Deutschland eigentlich schon fast gelöst.
Kurchatov was the scientific head of the bomb project, but in overall charge was Marshal Beria, head of the secret police and deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. His absolute power was critical in coordinating all the necessary resources. He and his deputy, Avrami Zavanyagin, were directly responsible for the execution of the bomb project.
You know that all the secret policy was under Beria. All that what is called from Solzhenitsyn the Gulag was under him, and all people were afraid of this organization.
Zavanyagin was a very clever and a very likable man, but he was also Lieutenant General of the NKVD. He was a very energetic man. He had to be. Those around him were scared of him, but even Zavanyagin was afraid of Beria.
He came once to our plant, and that was prepared since weeks, was prepared. And that was an impression unbelievable with that Beria, because that assistant minister, Zavanyagin, that was something what we in Germany call, this is a Herr, this is a gentleman. He came up, he was a man, very capable man, but when Beria was present, he had only spoken with him like this. That was for us in Germans, unbelievable how they were afraid of Beria, which was a very unpleasant man, but let's shake hands with Beria.
Beria put great pressure on the scientists to build the Soviets a bomb, feeding them information his spies stole from the US program.
I should explain that I told you that our technology was very unsatisfactory. And that changed rather soon, because the Russians could get a report from the Manhattan Project, which was either secret or confidential, I don't know it. At least I got also this report from the Manhattan Project, in which the Americans shortly had described their processes, how they made the nuclear pure uranium. And that was quite different from ours. And we felt that the American process, of course, was much better than our process. And so there was a decision to go ahead along the American line. So we went along this line, we installed a new purification plant, and later on the method making the metal was also modified. So that after some time we got really pure, good metal with the help of the Americans.
Some of the help the Soviets received came from inside the Manhattan Project itself, from physicist Klaus Fuchs, who gave them top-secret information. "14 months after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union made a critical advance, which the scientific and engineering skills of Nazi Germany had failed to achieve. Using the uranium Professor Riehl and Dr. Wirtz helped to produce, the first reactor in Europe became active in December 1946. But for the Soviet bomb project, there was still a long way to go. After the Soviets' occupation of Germany in 1945, they paid some of the rocket engineers who hadn't fled to the U.S. to continue their work on the V-2 rocket at a plant which they had taken over in Germany. One of these scientists was Dr. Kurt Magnus.
In Bleicherode, we had several people who were from a group of rocket experts, Peenemünde. This group worked on the outline and specifications of the A4 rocket. This was the former V2 rocket.
In October 1946, shortly before the first atomic reactor in the Soviet Union started working, a Soviet delegation came to see the rocket plant in Germany. The delegation, led by General Gaidukov, had plans for the German rocket experts.
General
Gaidukov was present and listened to all the proceedings. Then he said with a large gesture, "Well, you've been very industrious, and because you've been so industrious, I'd like to invite you to a dinner tonight." A huge table had been set up in a big hall there. The whole thing was lit in a festive manner. And we were offered a meal the likes of which we, at the time, remember it was autumn 1946, and there was nothing to eat in Germany. It was a meal the likes of which we'd never seen before. Fruit in absolute abundance, which was unheard of at the time. And of course, vodka, vodka, vodka. Nothing else. Only when the party was over, shortly before midnight, were we, each of us, individually taken home in a car by Soviet officers. And 3 hours later, they got us out of our beds.
Mrs. Grotrup's husband, one-time deputy to Werner von Braun, was the engineer in charge.
Mein Mann ging mit den Russen und mit einer ganzen Gruppe feiern.
My husband went to celebrate with a big group and with the Russians. Celebrations were always a big thing. I went to sleep, and around 3 a.m. I was wakened by the telephone. Someone, I can't remember who, said, "The Russians are at the front door. We're going to be taken away." And I thought it was a joke.
Echtes Leben gerettet. Da gab es ganz abenteuerliche Geschichten während dieser Fahrt.
We had some real adventures during the course of that journey, some wild stories. It seemed like, well, a bit like going west, only we were going east. We went off in a terrible rush that night. It all seemed chaotic to us, but the train left with all of us aboard.
If I remember rightly, there were on that train about 100 people, including families and children.
Wir haben den Zug bestiegen.
We got on the train that we weren't expected and weren't on any list, but my mother and I were immediately looked after. That's how organized it was.
So organisiert war das.
The point was to get us all to Russia as fast as possible. They stuck to that idea, but for us it was terrible. They had to get us there. They couldn't care how. That was it. End of story.
3
days into the journey, we were told we were going to Moscow. Then we drove into Moscow, and I found it incredibly shocking. I had never seen so much poverty in my life. I'd come from a destroyed Germany, and for the first time I could comprehend what this war had done. The houses hadn't been destroyed, but they were small and no longer properly habitable. And the people, it was shocking.
Das war erschütternd. Und die haben an den eigenen Schwierigkeiten, an der eigenen Hungersnot so viel
They had so many of their own problems, what with their famine, that they didn't talk about the war at all. Here and there we heard, the Americans have the atom bomb and we have nothing. So, Grotrup, at least build us some rockets. We have nothing. They can destroy us. That was the main thing.
Das war das Einzige.
The German rocket engineers were probably the most experienced in the world at that time. The leading Soviet rocket expert was Sergei Korolyov, who had actively pioneered the science in the 1930s and had carried out many experiments with small rockets. But in 1937, Korolyov was jailed by the KGB for espionage, and by the time of his rehabilitation, Soviet rocketry was primitive compared to the V-2. Korolyov was placed in joint charge of the rocket program with Dr. Grotrup.
Korolyov
and my husband were originally colleagues of the same rank. Both were chief construction engineers, so they could cooperate in running the German and Russian teams.
Just a short time ago, the German scientists had been working for Nazi Germany. Now, in the Soviet Union, they had little freedom. But compared to the Soviet people, they were treated very well.
Es ging uns sehr, sehr gut. Wir sind sehr gut versorgt worden.
After all, we were in good shape. We were all well taken care of. We were given much better food than the others, than the Russian population. Sometimes it was quite uncomfortable. All around us, people had to live very modestly, especially after the war. And we had everything. Sometimes that was rather embarrassing.
Das war manchmal sogar etwas peinlich.
Also ich habe da im Monat 800 Rubel bezogen.
I received about 800 rubles a month. Russian female colleagues in the same position earned 400 rubles. So as you can imagine, living alone, I could manage quite well on that. And my fiancé sent me flour and pudding from Brunswick. So we'd have pudding and we'd do some baking. There were things they weren't familiar with, and I must admit, it was quite pleasant.
Es war recht angenehm, muss ich sagen.
Da hatten zwei Leute eben ein Zimmer und dann immer einen Aufenthaltsraum.
2 people would have 1 room and a living room. To the Russians, those were fantastic living conditions. There were 8 or 9 to a room. I realized that later through a friend who showed me around Moscow. He didn't just take me to the cushy side. He also showed me the Arbat, the back streets. I really found that more fascinating than the things I usually saw, like Gorky Street in the Bolshoi Theater.
Yet however privileged the German scientists were, there was a price to pay. The Soviet Union had no atomic weapon and no effective way of delivering one. The Germans were there to help remedy this, and they were expected to deliver the goods.
Die erste Aufgabe, die wir auf dem Raketengebiet in der Sowjetunion bearbeitet haben, war die Rekonstruktion.
Our first task in the Soviet Union we worked on in the rocket field was the reconstruction of the A4 rocket. That was a job which didn't really entail anything more than putting together all the contemporary knowledge and findings about the construction as well as the experiments concerning the A4 rocket. The Russians had found several fairly complete rockets at the Middle Works factory. They'd brought them to the Soviet Union and had got them ready to launch. We had to do some preparatory work for that.
Und wir hatten gewissermaßen Vorarbeiten dafür zu leisten. Im Sommer 1947
in the summer of 1947, 6 or 8 colleagues from our group suddenly disappeared. We weren't told where they'd been taken. We were very worried that they'd been abducted again. But it soon transpired that they'd been taken to this rocket testing site.
In an area of bare desert, the Soviet Union had set up a rocket firing range at Kapustin Yar, near Kazakhstan.
Kasachische Steppe, Lehmhütten, Kamele.
Kazakh steppe, clay huts, camels, people in their huts. It was in such contrast to the most modern facility imaginable in the world. Even the Americans didn't have it. That contrast was almost impossible to live with.
Korolyov had arrived at the site and the first launch of an A4 was prepared. The date was set for September 29, 1947.
Und da gab ein Bein vielleicht Millimeter nach.
One leg shifted a few millimeters, but they wanted to go ahead with the launch. They had a deadline from Moscow. You will launch it on such a date. They had to, no matter what, or else it was sabotage. And so they used train sleepers and a winch to raise the whole thing up.
Zum ersten Mal in meinem Leben habe ich eine Rakete starten sehen, selbst starten sehen.
For the first time in my life, I saw a rocket self-ignite. Not just that, I was partly responsible for the third rocket being tested. I had to make sure it worked because the first 2 rockets hadn't reached their destinations. It was an interesting experience because I also got to know the chief Soviet rocket designer, Korolyov.
Der sowjetischen Raketentechnik, den Korolyov, ziemlich genau kennengelernt habe.
I got to know him pretty well. He was sometimes called the Werner von Braun of the Russians. We worked very closely with him during that time. He was responsible for that rocket launch on the Kazakh steppe. It was vital that nothing should go wrong. So he looked after us most diligently.
Betreute uns in der intensivsten Weise.
The series of rocket tests was successful.
After that launch, they were so happy and enthusiastic. They jumped up and down like little children. High-ranking ministers or not, they were just like little children. Then they grabbed their vodka bottles and got drunk.
But far from Kazakhstan, the atomic bomb program was still causing the Soviets considerable anxiety.
It was about 1947 that the assistant minister came up to our plant. He took me aside and said, well, we have now got a piece of American uranium metal and we have analyzed it. What do you think, he asked me, what metal is purer, American or ours? I said, without hesitating, yours is pure. He said, yes, it's true, and we are very proud of it. And I said, there's no use to be proud of it because the Americans make it just as pure as necessary, and you do by far more, and that makes it very expensive. And he said, you damn Germans.
The problem for Kurchatov and his team was to make the vital leap from the lab bench to industrial production.
I think that the conditions were very difficult, of course, but the power of the government was strong enough to start very quick the conditions for bringing up big industrial buildings and so on for doing the development of the industrial isotope separation. I had very good co-workers and good conditions according to the technical Soviet methods, and so the work could be done very quick. Tempo is the most important question in that field in that time.
Soviet resolve to catch up with the United States, now on a Cold War footing, deepened when they realized that U.S. scientists were continuing to build bombs.
Никогда до этого и после такого темпа работы напряженной не было. Это связано с тем.
Never has such high-pressure work been done at such speed. This is because we knew they were making bombs, and each month brought more and more bombs. They were accumulating. We knew from air analysis how many bombs there were. As it was wartime, people were fighting, but they enabled us to work here behind the lines. We worked hard, we were hungry, but we weren't fighting. But after the war, we realized that the construction of our giant reactors, institutes, and testing sites had deprived a great many people of food and housing, and that we owed them our utmost effort.
It required more than knowledge to build a bomb. A complex industry had to be created to handle all the stages in the production of the material for an atomic bomb. In the autumn of 1947, factories to produce enriched uranium were set up in Siberia. And in March 1948, work started on a series of industrial reactors that would produce plutonium on a large scale. The first one was operating 5 months later.
Let's just say that at the beginning, our reactors were not powerful, 100,000 kilowatts, and there was only one. We were afraid to go larger. This one could produce about 100 grams of plutonium in 24 hours, that is, one bomb in several months. But then further reactors appeared.
Starting from a very low level of industrial organization, the Soviet Union had created one of the most advanced industrial processes in the world.
They had reactors like you call the whole reactors in Great Britain. And that means that you have a moderator like graphite. And in this reactor, from the uranium is built up a small quantity of plutonium. And after some time, you take it out. You have highly reactive product now, and you have to separate the radioactive elements from uranium and from plutonium. And so you get plutonium. And you need the two pieces. If you shoot them together, then the bomb explodes. What we learn now.
On August 29, 1949, a second atomic power joined the world. Despite enormous problems, Kurchatov and his scientists had succeeded.
Поскольку стоял мой детектор и следил за тем, не получится отклонение.
I was there. I set up my detector and watched it for signs of anything that might go wrong. So I was the last to descend the tower, having done all my test work. And then I joined Kurchatov in the bunker. When the explosions occurred, Kurchatov looked as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, because there was a 10% chance of failure. He jumped out of the bunker and shouted, "It worked! It worked!" Such strong words. However, a cloud of dust was approaching the bunker, and I, also in a state of excitement, about 0.7 of the level of Kurchatov's, I put my arm around him and led him back into the bunker. That's how it was, how I remember it.
Wenn etwas sehr wichtig ist, entweder fürs Prestige.
When it's a question of prestige, either for political reasons or military reasons, then everyone's work is concentrated on this one problem, and it's solved.
Und das Problem wird gelöst.
Then somebody told us now that it's a great success and you will get awards and so for your work here. And we got later on. Well, that was in the plant or in Moscow, I don't remember. But very soon we learned that it had worked.
So wollte ich auch gar keine Orden oder Prämien oder irgendwas haben. Aber
I didn't want to receive any medals or anything. But after the success, after the Soviet atom bomb had been completed, medals were just handed out. I was even made a hero of socialist work as well. That's a very high distinction. It's also rather grotesque. I'm a great friend of Russia. I'm also against fighting the Soviet system. But I was never a socialist. I'm a friend of private enterprise, of the capitalist approach. And yet, it was I who got the Hero of Socialist Work medal, the Golden Star. Perhaps one more question that you really need to ask is, what would have happened? How far would the Soviet Union have gone if they'd had no help from the Germans? And if they'd had no espionage? The certain answer is that the Russians would have finished a year, maybe 2 years later, but no more than that.
Back in Kazakhstan, it didn't take long for the Germans to realize they were building rockets for the purpose of delivering atomic bombs beyond the Soviet borders.
Und ich habe mich mal mit meinem Mann auch darüber unterhalten, habe gesagt, weißt du eigentlich nicht, was du machst? Denn eines Tages war nämlich
I once asked my husband, don't you realize what you're doing? Because one day his brief was, Grotrip, you'll fire 3,000 kilometers. And I said, now, take a compass and consider this. You can hit the whole of Europe. He was dumbfounded, but he didn't react. He was just fascinated by solving this or that problem, a problem of steering, whatever it was. They didn't think about the consequences and didn't want to. At least not at that time.
Uns wurde nie gesagt, welche Aufgabe diese Raketen haben würden. Aber man kann sich ja überlegen.
We, of course, were never told what task the rockets would perform. But you could work out for yourself what it would be. The A4 rocket was capable of carrying a payload, say a 300-kilogram warhead, about 300 kilometers. It could carry a 3,000-kilogram warhead about 300 kilometers. Using that to transport an atomic warhead would have made no sense. The R-14 project was a rocket which was supposed to have a 3,000-kilometer range with about a 3,000-kilogram payload. Of course, these would have been suitable to carry an atomic bomb. Some of us began to grumble, and we said we preferred not to work on this rocket because our homes lay 2,000 kilometers from Moscow, and we didn't want to build rockets here which could be fired on our country.
By 1950, the German rocket scientists were moved yet again, this time to an island on Lake Seliger. Their growing reluctance and the Soviets' increasing knowledge made the team expendable.
War mein Mann noch eine kleine Weile auch Hauptkonstrukteur und dann wurde seines Postens enthoben.
At the time, my husband was still chief construction engineer. Then he was relieved of his post. Then we realized what was going on in the Gorodomya project. We were only there to supply Korolev with what he didn't know. That is, he still used to come with specific questions frequently at the beginning, but then at increasingly long intervals finally stopping altogether. We weren't asked anymore about the R-14, and with that, our work was finished.
Damit war eigentlich unsere Arbeit beendet.
They remained on the island for 3 more years, fearful about what would happen to them, not knowing if they would ever be allowed to return to Germany. Then, with the death of Stalin, the situation changed dramatically.
Stalins Tod haben wir durch die BBC erfahren.
We heard of Stalin's death on the BBC. We suddenly heard Stalin is tot. That is, Stalin is dead. We were excited at what might happen. Next morning, the Russian people came completely happy and said, "Stalin kaputt." That was the first we heard.
Das war das Erste, was wir hörten.
With the passing of the worst of repression, Mrs. Grotrup and the other Germans on the island were moved once again. But this time, they were going home.
Und ich war sehr erschüttert. Es gibt ja so ein Heine-Gedicht.
I was shattered. There's a Heine poem, and I drive over the border with tears. That came to mind a lot at the time, because we'd learned a lot in Russia, and I left many friends there. I came back quite different from when I'd gone. The war had changed me.
Ich bin auch aus dem Krieg anders geworden durch den Krieg. Ich kann nicht sagen, wir sind in alter Frische zurückgekehrt.
I can't say we returned with our former vigor. It had influenced me profoundly. It was a difficult time. The uncertainty bothered us most, at least it did me. Will I ever get home? Will I ever see my parents again? But now that we were back, now that it was all over, I could only feel that it had been an enriching time. I wouldn't have missed it.
Rückblickend möchte ich sie nicht vermissen.
Riel, Wirtz, and von Ardenne were asked to continue their work in the Soviet Union, but they chose to return home in the mid-1950s. They came back to a Germany that would be split into East and West for the next 3.5 decades, divided between 2 superpowers, one of which they had helped to arm.
I'm sitting here now, I'm in good health, and I have this small nice house in the countryside. What was the wrong side? I have never been a soldier, which during Hitler time was a great luck. I came back as a healthy man from the Soviet Union. And when I returned, so they had in Germany a need for a man who knew how to make nuclear pure uranium metal. And I was the only one who knew it at that time. So they gave me a job, and I developed this job. And I've wonderfully cooperated with the British, with the UK Atomic Energy Authority, and with the Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique in France, with the Americans. It was a wonderful life.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. And Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.